Woman gives birth to a baby that can control the weather. How is this even possible? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The storm had been brewing all night. Thick, rolling clouds gathered above the small hospital in the quiet town of Fairview, sending streaks of lightning across the sky. The rumble of thunder vibrated through the ground, shaking windows and rattling doors. Inside, the hospital staff worked anxiously, their movements hurried, their voices hushed. They weren't just dealing with the storm outside, they were dealing with something far more mysterious. In the maternity ward, Amelia Carter gripped the sides of her hospital bed, her breathing uneven. Sweat beaded on her forehead as another contraction seized her body. She had been in labor for hours, but something about this delivery felt different. The nurses whispered among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances as they monitored the machines around her. The baby's heartbeat was strong, rhythmic, but there was something unusual. The room's temperature kept fluctuating. One moment, it was sweltering, the air thick with heat. The next, a sudden chill crept through the room, causing the doctors to shiver. The lights flickered, and a distant crack of thunder echoed through the hallways. Dr. Mitchell, an experienced obstetrician, tried to keep his focus on Amelia, but even he couldn't ignore what was happening. "This isn't normal," one of the nurses whispered, checking the room thermostat. "It's like the storm is inside with us." Amelia barely registered their concerns. All she could focus on was the unbearable pain tearing through her body. She clenched her fists, gasping as she felt the overwhelming pressure, as if something far greater than childbirth was taking place. The moment she let out a final scream, the power in the hospital went out. Everything plunged into darkness. And then silence. The storm outside had stopped. The wind, the rain, the thunder, it had all disappeared in an instant. The air in the room turned still. Amelia, exhausted, barely had the strength to lift her head as the nurses scrambled to find the emergency flashlights. Then, a soft glow filled the room. It wasn't from the flashlights or any backup generator. It came from the newborn baby cradled in Dr. Mitchell's hands. A soft, golden aura surrounded the infant, pulsing like a heartbeat. The moment he took his first breath, the lights in the hospital flickered back to life. The storm outside resumed, but instead of chaotic winds, the rain fell in a perfect, rhythmic pattern, as if dancing to an unseen melody. The nurses gasped, stepping back in shock. Amelia, struggling to keep her eyes open, saw the expression on Dr. Mitchell's face, a mixture of awe and fear. What's happening?" she managed to whisper. Dr. Mitchell swallowed hard. He carefully handed the baby to Amelia, his hands shaking slightly. "But I don't know," he admitted. "But your son, he's different?" Amelia looked down at her newborn son, cradling him against her chest. His tiny fingers curled around her thumb, and for the first time, she noticed his eyes. They weren't the dull gray of most newborns. They were vibrant, shifting between shades of blue and gold, like the sky during a storm. And as he cooed softly, a gentle breeze flowed through the hospital room. Inside, where there were no windows open, word of the unusual birth spread through the hospital like wildfire. Staff whispered about the strange occurrences in the maternity ward, about the lights flickering, the temperature shifts, the sudden silence of the storm. Some dismissed it as a coincidence, but others, especially those who had been in the delivery room, knew better. A few hours after the birth, as Amelia rested in her bed, a man in a dark suit arrived at the hospital. He had no medical badge, no visitor's pass, yet he carried an air of authority that made even the hospital director hesitate. He entered Amelia's room without knocking, his sharp eyes immediately fixating on the newborn baby in her arms. "My name is Agent Collins," he said, flashing a government-issued ID. "I work with a special division that investigates unusual cases." Amelia frowned, instinctively holding her son closer. "Unusual?" Agent Collins took a step closer, lowering his voice. "There have been reports of atmospheric disturbances linked to your child's birth. We need to understand what happened here." Amelia's heart pounded. She had sensed something extraordinary about her son, but hearing it confirmed by a government agent terrified her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to stay calm. Agent Collins studied her for a long moment before sighing. "Listen, Miss Carter. We don't intend to harm you or your child. But if what the doctors and nurses say is true, then your son is special. And that means he could be in danger." Amelia's grip tightened. Danger from who? Agent Collins hesitated. There are people who would want to control him, to use his abilities for their own purposes. Amelia's blood ran cold. "He's just a baby." Collins nodded. "And that makes him even more vulnerable." At that moment, the baby stirred in her arms, his tiny fingers twitching. Outside, the sky darkened. Collins glanced at the window. "You need to leave town." Immediately. The decision to flee wasn't an easy one, but Amelia knew she had no choice. She had to protect her son. That night, under the cover of darkness, she packed a small bag, wrapped her newborn in a warm blanket, and slipped out of the hospital through the back entrance. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew one thing. No one was going to take her child away from her. As she stepped into the cool night air, the wind picked up around her, not harsh, not violent, but comforting, as if the earth itself was guiding her. And in that moment, she understood. Her son wasn't just any baby. He was a force of nature. Amelia drove through the empty highway, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The road stretched ahead, disappearing into the dense fog rolling in from the hills. She could still hear Agent Collins' warning in her head, but she had no time to think about what it meant. Her only focus was keeping her son safe. The baby, wrapped snugly in the softest blanket she could find, slept soundly in the back seat. Every now and then, his tiny fingers twitched, and the fog outside seemed to shift, moving in harmony with his breathing. Amelia didn't know what to make of it. She had always believed in science, in logic. But this was beyond anything she could comprehend. Her son was controlling the weather. She swallowed hard, keeping her eyes on the road. What did this mean for his future? Would he be hunted for what he could do? Was there any place they could be safe? A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and she instinctively glanced at her rearview mirror. Headlights. A single black SUV followed at a steady distance. Her pulse spiked. She didn't know if it was the government, or worse, someone who wanted to take her baby. She pressed the gas pedal, heart pounding. The SUV matched her speed. She weaved through the empty lanes, hoping to lose them, but the vehicle stayed close. Too close. Then her son stirred. The moment he let out a soft whimper, the wind howled through the trees. The fog thickened, swallowing the road ahead. The headlights of the SUV flickered in and out of sight, and suddenly, they were gone. The vehicle had vanished into the dense mist. Amelia's breath hitched. She slowed the car, glancing around, trying to see through the unnatural fog. Had her son done this? She looked back at him. He was awake now, his bright, storm-colored eyes staring at her. And in that moment, she knew. Her child wasn't just reacting to the weather. He was controlling it. She kept driving until she reached a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of a quiet town. Parking far from the main road, she carried her son inside, paid for a room in cash, and locked the door behind her. The weight of everything crashed down on her. Her son was being hunted. He had a gift that no one understood, and the world was dangerous for him. She had no idea what to do next. As she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at him, the baby giggled. A soft gust of wind brushed against her cheek, even though the windows were closed. Tears welled in her eyes. She reached out, running her fingers through his soft hair. "What are you, little one?" she whispered. Outside, the rain stopped. The next morning, Amelia was woken by a sharp knock at the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed her son, holding him close. "Who is it?" she called out, keeping her voice steady. "It's me." She froze. She recognized that voice. Slowly, she unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see the man standing outside. Agent Collins. His expression was calm, but his eyes were wary. "You need to come with me," he said. "It's not safe here." Amelia didn't move. "Why should I trust you?" He sighed, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Because they're coming. And if they find you first, you'll never see your son again." A chill ran down her spine. She looked down at her baby, his small fingers grasping the edge of her sleeve. She didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, she stepped outside. And the moment she did, the wind whispered through the trees, as if the earth itself was watching. Amelia followed Agent Collins down the dimly lit hallway of the motel, her arms wrapped tightly around her son. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. The agent led her toward a black sedan parked discreetly behind the building. "Get in," he said, glancing around as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. She hesitated. "Where are you taking us?" "To a safe house," he replied. "Somewhere off the grid. No cameras. No government access." Amelia's grip on her son tightened. "Why are you helping us?" Collins sighed, his jaw tightening. "Because I know what happens to people like your son when they fall into the wrong hands." He looked her in the eye, his expression unreadable. "And I won't let that happen." She didn't trust him. Not completely. But she had no better options. Taking a deep breath, she slid into the back seat, cradling her baby as Collins started the car. The moment the engine roared to life, the sky darkened. They drove for hours, weaving through backroads and avoiding highways. Amelia kept glancing at her son, who was wide-eyed but calm, as if he knew they were running for their lives. Eventually, Collins pulled off the road and into a secluded cabin deep in the woods. The place looked abandoned, its wooden exterior worn from years of neglect. "This is it?" Amelia asked skeptically. Collins nodded. "No one knows about this place. You'll be safe here." Amelia stepped out, scanning their surroundings. The air was still. Too still. Then her son let out a small sound, a whimper, almost like a warning. The wind shifted. Collins stiffened. "We need to get inside." Now, the moment they stepped inside, the baby's breathing changed. Amelia didn't understand what was happening, but she trusted his instincts. Collins locked the doors, pulling out his phone. "They found us faster than I thought," he muttered. Amelia's blood ran cold. "Who?" Collins exhaled. "There's an agency, one that specializes in unexplained phenomena. They don't just study people like your son." He looked at her grimly. "They take them." She clutched her baby protectively. "Why?" "Because power like his doesn't go unnoticed," Collins said. "And they don't care about his life. Only what they can learn from him." A gust of wind howled outside. The storm was coming back. And this time, Amelia wasn't sure if it was her son or something worse. The next few hours were a blur. Collins worked quickly, setting up what looked like old radio transmitters, using outdated tech that couldn't be traced. Amelia sat by the fireplace, rocking her son, whispering soothing words even as her own heart pounded in fear. Then, a sound shattered the silence. The crunch of footsteps outside. Collins snapped his head up. "They're here." Amelia's breath hitched. She held her baby close as the front door shuddered violently. A voice called out from the other side. "Miss Carter, we know you're in there." Hand over the child. Collins reached for his gun, but Amelia barely heard him. She was focused on her son. His tiny hands trembled, his breath shallow. He knew they were here for him. And then, the world outside changed. The storm arrived with a vengeance. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the trees like daytime. The wind roared, shaking the cabin's walls. The men outside shouted in confusion as rain pounded down, turning the ground into a swirling sea of water. And in the eye of the storm, Amelia's son opened his eyes. They glowed. Collins took a step back. "Oh my God!" Amelia barely had time to react before the door exploded outward. The agents outside screamed as a force. A wind stronger than any storm lifted them off their feet and hurled them into the darkness. The trees bent, the earth shook, and the sky itself seemed to respond to the will of a single infant. Her son. And then, silence. The storm was gone. The men were gone. And in her arms, the baby sighed softly, as if he had simply put the world back in place. Amelia held him tighter. Collins exhaled. "We're in over our heads." Amelia nodded. She didn't know what her son was. But she knew one thing. He wasn't meant for this world. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing as he stared at the piece of paper in front of him. It was a letter from Coach Harrison, detailing a rigorous training program that would push him to the limits. His mother leaned against the counter, watching him carefully. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "It's a big commitment." Jamal nodded, his jaw set. "I've worked too hard to let someone like Stevens take this away from me." She crossed the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know you'll make us proud. Just take care of yourself." Jamal smiled, a flicker of excitement sparking in his eyes. "I will, ma." 2 days later, Jamal found himself standing at the edge of a sprawling training facility. Athletes of all shapes and sizes sprinted across tracks, lifted weights, and practiced drills. Coach Harrison approached, his presence commanding yet kind. "Welcome to your new home," Harrison said with a grin. "Hope you're ready to work." Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline build. "I'm ready." The next few weeks were grueling. Early mornings, late nights, and every moment in between filled with intense workouts and drills. Jamal's muscles burned, his legs felt like lead, but he pushed through the pain. Every time he felt like giving up, he thought of Coach Stevens' smirk, the injustice of it all, and it fueled him. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal session, Jamal collapsed onto the grass, panting heavily. Coach Harrison stood over him, arms crossed. "Not bad, kid," he said. "But I need more than not bads if you want to make it to the Olympic trials." Jamal sat up, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I've got more. I'll show you." Harrison nodded approvingly. "That's what I like to hear." As the weeks turned into months, Jamal's times improved. His form tightened, his endurance skyrocketed. He was becoming a machine, focused and relentless. Then, one evening as Jamal was cooling down, Harrison approached, a serious look on his face. "We've got a problem," he said. Jamal frowned. "What's up?" Harrison handed him a newspaper clipping. "State referee to officiate at national qualifiers." Jamal's stomach dropped. "Coach Stevens. This guy has it out for you," Harrison said quietly. "He's not going to play fair." Jamal clenched his fists. "I don't care. I'll beat them all fair and square." Harrison nodded slowly. "I know you will. But we need to be smart about this." They spent the next few days strategizing, preparing for any trick Stevens might pull. Jamal felt a new fire within him. He wasn't just running for himself anymore. He was running for every athlete who had ever been cheated, belittled, or overlooked. The day of the national qualifiers arrived. The stadium was packed, the air electric with excitement. Jamal stood at the starting line, his heart pounding. He spotted Coach Stevens on the sidelines, his eyes cold and calculating. The starter raised his pistol, and Jamal focused on the finish line. This was his moment. The gun fired, and Jamal exploded forward, his legs pumping like pistons. The crowd's roar was deafening, but all he could hear was his own breathing, his own heartbeat. As he neared the finish line, a whistle blew. Jamal stumbled to a stop, confusion washing over him. Stevens approached, a smug grin on his face. "False start," he declared. "You're out." The crowd erupted in boos. People shouted from the stands, demanding answers. But Stevens stood firm. "Rules are rules," he repeated, his voice dripping with arrogance. Jamal's hands trembled with rage. "I didn't false start. You're lying." Before Stevens could respond, another official stepped in, glancing nervously between them. "I think we need to review the footage." Stevens' smile faltered. Moments later, the replay played on the big screen. Jamal's start was clean. No false start, no violation. The crowd cheered, chanting his name. "Let him run! Let him run!" The officials huddled together, whispering urgently. Finally, one of them approached Jamal, nodding. "You're back in." Jamal felt a surge of relief. He returned to the starting line, his focus sharper than ever. This time, when the gun fired, he left everyone behind, his feet barely touching the ground as he flew toward the finish line. He crossed first, setting a new national record. As he slowed to a stop, the stadium erupted. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his face. "How does it feel to prove everyone wrong?" Jamal smiled, his eyes fierce. "I let my speed do the talking." In the distance, he saw Stevens, his face pale, his confidence shattered. Jamal knew this was just the beginning. The world was finally paying attention, and he was ready to show them exactly what he was made of. The stadium lights had long since dimmed, but Jamal Carter's name still echoed across the world. Olympic champion, record breaker, the kid they tried to stop. His gold medal now sat in a velvet-lined case, tucked neatly inside his mother's home. But the real prize? His legacy had begun. The morning after his historic win, Jamal's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. His name was on every news outlet, trending across social media. Reporters dissected every moment of the race, slow-motion replays playing on loop. Former Olympians weighed in, praising his technique, his drive, his resilience. His story was no longer just about a race, it was about something bigger. Brands reached out, offering sponsorship deals. Colleges called, hoping he would consider their track programs. But none of that mattered to Jamal just yet. He had spent his whole life fighting for this moment. Now, he just wanted to breathe it in. Sitting in his hotel room, he stared out the window at the Olympic Village, still coming to terms with the fact that he had made history. His mother sat across from him, sipping coffee, watching him with quiet pride. "You did it, baby," she finally said. Jamal smiled, shaking his head. "We did it, Mum." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "So what now?" He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know. I never thought this far ahead." His mother chuckled. "Well, you better start. Because the world isn't done watching you." She was right. 2 days later, he was back in the United States, stepping off the plane to find a massive crowd waiting for him at the airport. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in his direction. Fans held signs, some with his face, others with words that made his chest tighten. "We saw you. They couldn't stop you. Run, Jamal, run." He signed autographs, took pictures, answered a few questions. But as much as the attention excited him, it also reminded him of why he had started running in the first place. It wasn't just about proving people wrong. It was about proving himself right. The days turned into weeks, and Jamal tried to settle back into a routine, but nothing was the same. He couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. Invitations poured in, talk shows, award ceremonies, charity events. And then, one afternoon, as he was cooling down from a run at his old high school track, his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He answered, expecting another reporter or sponsorship offer. But the voice on the other end caught him off guard. "Jamal Carter?" "Speaking. This is Michael Warner from the U.S. Olympic Committee. We'd like to discuss your future with Team USA." Jamal wiped sweat from his forehead, gripping the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "We mean long-term. Training, development. You're not just a one-time champion, son. You've got the potential to be a legend." Jamal felt his breath catch. He had spent his whole life chasing a dream. But now, a new thought crept into his mind. What if this was just the beginning? The following week, he sat across from Warner in an office overlooking a professional training facility. The walls were lined with framed photographs of past Olympic champions, their names etched in history. Warner leaned forward, studying him carefully. "You're young. You've got speed, endurance, and mental toughness. But the question is, do you want more?" Jamal didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then it's time to start thinking beyond one gold medal." Warner slid a contract across the table. "This is a commitment. It's more training, more discipline. It means dedicating yourself to this sport for the next decade. Think carefully before you sign." Jamal picked up the pen, staring at the paper in front of him. He thought about everything that had led him here. The early mornings, the setbacks, the humiliation of that first disqualification. The anger, the fight, the triumph. He wasn't running just for himself anymore. He was running for every kid who had ever been told they weren't good enough. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name. When he walked out of the building, he felt lighter. The next 4 years would be grueling, but he welcomed it. Because he knew what came at the end of it. Another Olympic Games. Another race. Another chance to remind the world exactly who he was. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about Coach Stevens for the first time in weeks. He wondered if the man had watched the Olympic final, if he had seen what Jamal had accomplished despite his efforts to hold him back. But then Jamal let the thought go. Coach Stevens was his past. And Jamal? He was only looking forward. For years passed in a blur. Jamal Carter had gone from being the youngest Olympic champion in the 100-meter sprint to becoming a global icon. He had trained relentlessly, his focus razor-sharp, his body stronger than ever. Every day was a test of discipline, endurance, and mental fortitude. But he never lost sight of his goal. He was no longer just a runner. He was a symbol of resilience, of defiance, of proving that no one could dictate his future but himself. The world was watching him now, waiting to see if he could do what few had ever done before: defend his title, win back-to-back Olympic golds, and cement his legacy as one of the greatest sprinters of all time. The pressure was suffocating, but Jamal welcomed it, because pressure had never broken him. It had only made him faster. The Olympic trials were different this time. The crowd knew him. The media followed his every move. He wasn't the underdog anymore. He was the favorite. And when the gun fired, he didn't just win. He dominated. He crossed the finish line half a second ahead of the next fastest runner. His time, 9.68 seconds, was the fastest ever recorded at the Olympic trials. The world took notice. Commentators called him unstoppable. Former Olympians compared him to the greatest sprinters in history. And once again, the stage was set. The Olympics. The 100-meter final. The race that would determine if Jamal Carter was just a moment in history, or if he would become a legend. The night before the final, Jamal sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling. The weight of expectation pressed down on him. He had already achieved more than most athletes ever dreamed of. But he wasn't done. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He picked it up and saw a message from his mother. "It's just another race. Do what you do best. I love you." He smiled. She always knew what to say. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the exhaustion pull him into sleep. The next evening, the stadium was electric. The world's fastest men lined up beside him, every one of them hungry for gold. The cameras zoomed in on their faces, their muscles tense, their minds locked in. Jamal exhaled, shaking out his arms. He had done this before. He had felt this pressure before. But this time, he wasn't running to prove himself. He was running because this was what he was meant to do. The announcer's voice boomed across the stadium. "On your marks." Jamal lowered into position, hands planted, legs coiled like springs. "Set." His heartbeat slowed. His mind cleared. Bang. Jamal exploded forward. His legs churned like pistons, his body in perfect sync with the rhythm of the race. The world blurred around him. He didn't hear the roar of the crowd, didn't feel the pressure of expectations. All he felt was speed. He pulled ahead. 70 meters. 80. 90. And then, the finish line. Jamal threw his chest forward, his body slicing through the tape. He stumbled to a stop, gasping for air, his mind spinning. He turned toward the giant screen, watching as the times flashed across the display. First place. Jamal Carter, 9.61 seconds. A new Olympic record. A beat of silence. Then, the stadium erupted. Jamal dropped to his knees, hands over his face. He had done it. Again. His mother was in the stands, crying, clapping, shouting his name. His coach hugged anyone within reach. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the face of a man who had just made history. As he stood on the podium once more, the gold medal placed around his neck, the national anthem playing, he knew something for certain. This wasn't just about winning. It was about every kid who had been doubted, every athlete who had been cheated, every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. It was about legacy. And Jamal Carter's legacy was just getting started. That night, as he sat in his hotel room, scrolling through the endless messages and news coverage, he paused at an article that caught his eye. "Where is former referee Coach Stevens now?" He hesitated for a second, then clicked the link. The article detailed how Stevens had vanished from the track and field world. After being banned from officiating, he had faded into obscurity. Some reports claimed he had taken a job at a local gym. coaching kids who would likely never compete at a high level. Jamal stared at the screen for a moment, then shook his head. He had no anger left for that man. No resentment. Because while Stevens had spent his life trying to control who won and who lost, Jamal had proven one undeniable truth. No one could control greatness. He put his phone down, stretched his legs, and smiled. His race wasn't over. Not yet. The plane touched down smoothly, and as Jamal Carter stepped off, the familiar scent of home filled his lungs. The city skyline stretched out before him, but this time, everything felt different. He wasn't just returning as Jamal, the kid with big dreams. He was coming back as a two-time Olympic champion, a world record holder, and a living legend. But none of that mattered as much as the moment he saw his mother waiting at the gate. She stood with her arms crossed, eyes glistening, her face a mixture of pride and relief. The moment she spotted him, she rushed forward, wrapping him in the kind of hug that made the world disappear. "You're still my baby boy, no matter how fast you are," she whispered, holding him tight. Jamal chuckled, hugging her back. "And you're still the only person who could tell me to slow down." They walked together toward baggage claim, past flashing cameras and eager reporters. He nodded politely, but he wasn't in the mood for interviews. Not today. When they reached the car, his mother looked over at him. "What's next?" Jamal leaned back in his seat, exhaling. "Honestly, I just want to be home for a while. Sleep in my own bed. Eat something that doesn't come from a nutrition plan." She laughed. "That sounds like a good start." But even as he said it, Jamal knew his mind wouldn't rest for long. Greatness never settled. The following week, Jamal visited his old high school. It had been years since he last walked through those hallways, but the moment he stepped onto the track, memories came flooding back. The first races, the early morning practices, the frustration, the doubts, the injustice that had nearly broken him. And yet, here he was. A group of students gathered around, their faces filled with admiration. Some of them were too young to have watched his early struggles, but they all knew his story. One boy stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Carter, sir, do you have any advice for someone who wants to be like you?" Jamal smiled, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "First, don't call me sir. Makes me feel old." The kids laughed, the tension breaking. "Second, don't try to be like me. Be better." The boy's eyes widened. "But how?" Jamal exhaled, thinking for a moment. "You'll hear a lot of people tell you what you can't do. Ignore them. You'll face obstacles that feel unfair, like the world is trying to keep you down. Push through them. The only person who gets to decide how far you go is you." The group nodded, absorbing every word. A girl raised her hand. "Did you ever feel like quitting?" Jamal thought about it. "Yeah, a lot of times. But then I realized something. Every time I wanted to quit, it was because someone else was trying to make me believe I wasn't good enough. And that's when I ran harder." The girl grinned. "So, we should run harder?" Jamal smirked. Every time. As he stood up, he saw his old coach, Coach Ramirez, standing near the bleachers, arms crossed with a proud smile. Jamal walked over, shaking his hand. "You really came back to teach these kids, huh?" Ramirez asked. Jamal glanced back at the students, who were now racing each other, shouting about who was the fastest. He smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I think it's time to give back." The following months were a whirlwind. Offers poured in, not just for races and endorsements, but for something bigger. Schools wanted him to consult on track programs. Organizations asked him to speak about overcoming adversity. One night, as he sat in his apartment, staring at the city lights, his phone buzzed. A familiar name popped up on the screen. "Oprah." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head before answering. "You really do call at the craziest times?" Oprah's warm laughter filled the line. "You'd be surprised how often I hear that. I saw your race. Finn. You just keep making history, don't you?" Jamal leaned back. "I guess so. Well," she continued, "I have a question for you. What's the next race?" Jamal hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because for the first time, the race wasn't just on a track. "I want to start something," he said finally. "A foundation. For kids who don't get a fair shot in sports. Training, scholarships, opportunities. No politics, no bias. Just talent and hard work. Oprah was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice full of warmth. Jamal, that's exactly what the world needs. And I'd love to help. Jamal felt a lump in his throat. He had won medals, broken records, changed perceptions. But this could be his greatest victory yet. 2 weeks later, the Carter Foundation for Equal Opportunity in Sports was officially announced. The mission was simple: no child would ever lose their dream because of biased officials, lack of resources, or the color of their skin. At the press conference, standing in front of the world once again, Jamal took the microphone, looking out at the crowd. "I used to think my biggest achievement would be winning races," he said. "But I was wrong. My biggest achievement will be making sure every kid out there gets a fair chance to run their own." The applause was deafening. And as Jamal stepped off the stage, watching young athletes beam with excitement, he knew his race would never truly be over. And that was just fine with him. Months passed, and the Carter Foundation for Equal Opportunity in Sports gained momentum faster than Jamal had imagined. What had started as an idea in his apartment was now changing lives across the country. Schools began partnering with his foundation, bringing in trainers and resources for young athletes who had talent but lacked opportunities. Former Olympic champions reached out, offering to mentor the next generation. Donations poured in, allowing the foundation to cover travel expenses, equipment, and even legal support for athletes facing discrimination. Jamal's inbox was flooded with messages from parents, coaches, and young athletes thanking him for giving them a chance. One email stood out. It was from a boy named Elijah, a 16-year-old track star from the Midwest. "Mr. Carter, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I just wanted to say thank you. I was disqualified from my last race for something I didn't do, and I almost quit. But then I watched your races and I saw how you never stopped. My coach told me about your foundation, and now I have a real shot at competing at nationals. You gave me hope when I didn't think I had any left. Thank you." Jamal sat back in his chair, staring at the words. This was bigger than him. It always had been. He wasn't just running for himself anymore. He was running for every kid who had ever been held back, doubted, or cheated. One evening, as he was finalizing the details for a new training camp, his phone rang. It was Coach Harrison. "Jamal, I've got something big for you," Harrison said. Jamal chuckled. "What, another race? I thought I earned a break." Harrison's voice was serious. "Not just any race. The World Championships. It's in 8 months. You've got a chance to make history again." Jamal exhaled, rubbing his chin. He had been so focused on the foundation that he hadn't thought much about competing again. "You think I still have it in me?" he asked. Harrison laughed. "Jamal, you're not just fast. You're a movement. And movements don't slow down." Jamal closed his eyes, thinking about it. The rush of the starting line, the roar of the crowd, the feeling of proving everyone wrong. He opened his eyes, determination settling in. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." And just like that, the race was back on. His training ramped up, more intense than ever. This wasn't just about maintaining his speed, he was pushing past his limits. Early mornings, late nights, grueling workouts that left his body screaming for rest. But every time exhaustion whispered for him to stop, he thought of the kids watching him. The kids who needed to know that no matter how many obstacles were thrown in their way, they could break through. When the World Championships finally arrived, the stadium was packed. Jamal stepped onto the track, feeling the familiar heat of the lights, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The commentators were already speculating. Could he do it again? Could he still dominate after 4 years of giving so much of himself to something beyond the track? Jamal smirked. They were still doubting him. Because doubt had always been his fuel. He settled into position, feeling the calm before the storm. The gun fired, and Jamal Carter ran like a man who had never been stopped. His body was a machine, honed and sharpened by years of fighting, of proving, of refusing to accept limits. He surged forward, the track blurring beneath him. He didn't just win. He set another record. As he crossed the finish line, chest heaving, he heard the thunderous cheers, the disbelief in the announcers' voices. He had done it again. and as he stood on the podium, another gold medal placed around his neck, he looked out into the crowd and spotted Elijah, the boy who had emailed him, standing near the front row, his eyes wide with admiration. Jamal gave him a nod, because one day it would be Elijah's turn to stand on this podium. And when that day came, Jamal would be right there, cheering him on. As the national anthem played, Jamal closed his eyes and smiled. His race would never truly be over, and he wouldn't have it any other way.